My name is Evelyn Carter, and this is the story of how I went from being just another face in a sea of gray suits to becoming the nightmare that keeps corporate executives awake at night. You're probably wondering how someone like me, a woman who spent years climbing the corporate ladder, playing by their rules, and wearing the same tired uniform of ambition, ended up on the other side of the table. Trust me, so am I. But life has a funny way of teaching you lessons when you least expect them. Let's rewind to 6 months ago. Back then, I was nothing special, just your average mid-level executive at Sterling and Company, one of those massive consulting firms that everyone pretends to respect but secretly despises. We sold ideas for millions while charging our clients exorbitant fees to fix problems we often created ourselves. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough to keep my rent covered and my student loans at bay. And honestly, I liked it. Or at least, I convinced myself I did. I worked hard, not because I loved what I did, but because I had to. Growing up in a small town where opportunities were as scarce as sunlight during winter taught me early on that success doesn't come easy. So I hustled. I stayed late. I nodded politely through meetings filled with meaningless jargon and forced smiles. I even wore the right clothes, the tailored blazers, the perfectly pressed slacks, the shoes polished until they gleamed like mirrors. Because in a place like Sterling, image mattered almost as much as results, maybe more. And then one day everything changed. Not because I made some grand mistake or uncovered some dark secret lurking beneath the company's shiny veneer. No, it happened over something so absurdly trivial that I still can't believe it sometimes. A dress code violation. It started innocently enough. The email came late Friday afternoon, the kind you get when management wants to ruin your weekend before it even begins. Dress code reminder, the subject line read. Inside, there was the usual spiel about professionalism and representing the brand. Nothing new. But buried halfway through the message was a single line that caught my attention. Effective immediately, all female employees must adhere strictly to skirt lengths no shorter than 2 inches above the knee. Now, let me be clear. I'm not someone who spends hours agonizing over fashion trends or obsessing about what I wear. My wardrobe consisted of pieces I could mix and match without thinking too much about it. That included a charcoal gray pencil skirt that hit exactly at the 2-inch mark. Or so I thought. Apparently, someone upstairs decided it didn't meet their standards anymore. Monday morning rolled around, and I walked into the office feeling confident. I'd paired the skirt with a crisp white blouse, a blazer, and heels sharp enough to cut glass. As far as I was concerned, I looked professional, respectable, ready to tackle whatever nonsense Monday threw my way. What I wasn't prepared for was the icy glare waiting for me at the reception desk. "Miss Carter," said Margaret Hensley, our HR director, her voice clipped and cold. "A word, please." Margaret was the kind of woman who thrived on power trips. She carried herself like she owned the building, despite the fact that her role mostly involved sending out memos about parking passes and reminding people to log their vacation days properly. Still, I followed her into her office, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. "Evelyn," she began once the door clicked shut behind us, "we received reports that your attire today does not comply with the updated dress code policy." Her tone was saccharine sweet, but her eyes told a different story, one of smug satisfaction. I blinked, sure I'd misheard her. "Excuse me." "The skirt," she said, gesturing vaguely toward my legs. "It falls slightly above the acceptable length. Moving forward, we'll need you to ensure compliance." For a moment, I just stood there, stunned. Was this really happening? Over an inch or less of fabric? "Margaret," I said slowly, "this skirt has been part of my work wardrobe for years. No one's ever raised an issue before." "That was before the policy update," she replied, her smile never wavering. "We take these matters very seriously here at Sterling. Consistency is key." Consistency. Right. Because policing women's hemlines was clearly the cornerstone of corporate integrity. I bit back the retort forming on my lips and nodded stiffly. "I understand. Thank you for bringing this to my attention." But it didn't end there. Oh no. By Wednesday, I found myself summoned to yet another meeting, this time with Richard Langston, the VP of Operations. If Margaret was the queen of passive-aggressive bureaucracy, Richard was her king. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled, and regarded me like I was some sort of puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Evelyn," he began, his voice dripping with faux concern, "we've noticed a pattern of non-compliance regarding the dress code. It's important that we maintain a certain standard, both internally and externally. Clients trust us to represent their interests professionally." "I assure you, Richard, I've always prioritized professionalism," I said evenly, though my jaw clenched. "If there's any confusion about the specifics of the policy, I'd be happy to clarify." He waved a hand dismissively. "It's not about clarification. It's about adherence. Unfortunately, given the circumstances, we feel it's best to place you on a formal warning. Further violations will result in disciplinary action." Disciplinary action. For wearing a skirt. At that point, I realized something fundamental had shifted, not just within Sterling, but within me. This wasn't about professionalism or client perception. It was control. Pure, unadulterated control. And I hated it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of simmering resentment and quiet defiance. I bought new skirts, longer ones, hoping to avoid further scrutiny. But every interaction with HR felt like walking on eggshells. Every glance from my colleagues carried the weight of judgment. And worst of all, every victory I achieved at work seemed tainted, overshadowed by the knowledge that none of it truly mattered unless I fit neatly into their narrow definition of acceptability. Then came the final straw. A major deal, $60 million worth of contracts, was on the line. Months of negotiations, late nights, and endless presentations had led us to this moment. The client, a tech startup looking to expand its operations globally, trusted Sterling to guide them through the process. And guess who had been leading the charge? Me, Evelyn Carter, the woman whose skirt length apparently posed such a grave threat to corporate dignity. Everything was set. The contracts were drafted. The terms agreed upon. All that remained was the final sign-off. Until, of course, disaster struck. I arrived at the office early that morning, buzzing with adrenaline. Today was the day, the culmination of months of relentless effort. But instead of congratulatory handshakes or celebratory coffee runs, I was met with silence. An eerie, oppressive silence that hung heavy in the air. Richard called me into his office. His expression said it all before he even opened his mouth. "Evelyn," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "due to ongoing concerns about your adherence to company policies, we've decided to reassign the account, effective immediately." "What?" The word slipped out before I could stop it. "Reassign? Why?" "It's a matter of trust," he replied, his gaze steady. "Given recent events, we feel it's in the best interest of both the firm and the client to make this change." Trust. The irony nearly choked me. After everything I'd done, every sacrifice, every ounce of energy poured into making this deal happen, they were pulling the rug out from under me over a skirt. Over a goddamn skirt. By the time I left his office, my hands were trembling. Anger burned hot and bright in my chest, threatening to consume me whole. But beneath the fury lay something else, clarity. Suddenly, I saw Sterling for what it truly was, a machine built on exploitation, fear, and hypocrisy. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't stay. Not anymore. So I quit. On the spot. Without hesitation. I marched into Margaret's office, dropped my ID badge onto her desk, and told her exactly where she could shove her precious dress code. Then I walked out of Sterling and Company for the last time, my head held high. Or so I thought. What I didn't realize then, what none of them realized, was that walking away wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning. Because, while they might have taken my job, my dignity, and my pride, they hadn't taken my access, my connections, my knowledge of every dirty little secret Sterling and Company tried so desperately to hide. And now it was my turn to play the game. Their faces when the federal agents showed up. Well, that's a story for another time. The day I walked out of Sterling and Company, I felt like a stranger in my own life. For years, I had defined myself by that job, by the title on my business card, the corner office with its view of the city skyline, the endless stream of emails and meetings that made me feel important. But now I was untethered. Free, yes, but also directionless. The anger that had fueled my exit was still burning bright. But beneath it lay an emptiness I wasn't ready to confront. I spent the first week doing what anyone else might do after such a seismic shift. Nothing. I slept late, avoided answering calls from concerned friends, and stared blankly at the walls of my apartment as if they held some kind of answer. My mind kept returning to Richard's smug face when he told me the $60 million deal was no longer mine, to Margaret's condescending tone as she lectured me about professionalism, to the way my co-workers whispered behind my back, their eyes darting away whenever I caught them looking. But then, one morning, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the realization that I couldn't keep living in this limbo, replaying those moments over and over again until they consumed me. Or maybe it was the email notification that popped up on my phone, a routine update from the company-wide newsletter, sent automatically to former employees who hadn't yet unsubscribed. Whatever the trigger, I opened it and there it was. A press release announcing the successful completion of the $60 million deal. Except it wasn't successful. Not really. According to the glowing write-up, the client had expressed minor concerns during final negotiations, which Sterling's team, led by none other than Richard Langston, had handled with unparalleled expertise and finesse. Lies. All of it. I knew better. I'd been the one sitting across from the client, reading between the lines of their questions, addressing their hesitations head-on. They didn't want unparalleled expertise. They wanted authenticity, trust, and Richard, for all his polished arrogance, couldn't deliver that. As I read through the article, my blood began to boil again. But this time it wasn't just anger, it was determination. These people thought they could erase me, rewrite history, and take credit for work I'd pour my soul into. They thought they could humiliate me, strip me of everything I'd worked for, and walk away unscathed. And maybe, under normal circumstances, they would have been right. But Evelyn Carter wasn't going to let them get away with it. The first step was gathering evidence. Over the years, I'd accumulated more than just stress ulcers and sleepless nights. I'd also amassed a treasure trove of documents, emails, and notes detailing every aspect of the deal. From initial pitches to revised contracts, I had it all saved meticulously on both my personal laptop and a secure cloud drive. At the time, I'd done it out of habit, wanting to ensure I had backup copies in case anything went wrong. Now, those files became my ammunition. Sifting through them brought back memories I'd rather forget. The late-night strategy sessions, the tense conference calls, the endless revisions demanded by clients who couldn't make up their minds. But it also reminded me of how much I'd accomplished. This wasn't just any deal, it was a career-defining moment. And Sterling had stolen it from me. Once I had everything organized, I reached out to someone I trusted implicitly, Marcus Hale. Marcus and I had started at Sterling around the same time, bonding over a shared disdain for corporate politics and mutual love of bad coffee. Unlike me, though, he'd managed to navigate the system without losing himself completely. When I called him, he sounded surprised, but immediately agreed to meet. We met at a quiet cafe downtown, far enough from Sterling's headquarters to avoid prying eyes. Marcus listened intently as I laid out my plan, his expression shifting from shock to admiration. By the time I finished, he was nodding slowly. "You realize this is risky, right?" he said, stirring sugar into his latte. "If you go after them like this, there's no turning back." "I know," I replied, meeting his gaze, "but I can't let them win. Not like this." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, here's what you need to understand. Sterling doesn't play fair. If you're serious about taking them down, you'll need proof. Not just of what happened with the deal, but of everything. The toxic culture, the favoritism, the way they treat women like disposable assets. You think your dress code fiasco was an isolated incident? It's not. It's part of a pattern." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There are others who feel the same way you do. People who've been pushed aside, passed over, or outright screwed because they didn't fit the mold. If you're willing to fight, you won't be alone." That conversation changed everything. With Marcus's help, I began reaching out to former colleagues, people who'd left Sterling under similar circumstances, disillusioned and defeated. Some were hesitant at first, afraid of retaliation or unsure whether it was worth dredging up old wounds. But as word spread, more and more voices joined the chorus. Together, we pieced together a damning picture of Sterling and Company's inner workings. Discriminatory practices, unethical business dealings, and a culture of fear designed to silence dissent. While the investigation took shape, I focused on another angle, the client. Remembering the minor concerns mentioned in the press release, I decided to reach out directly. It wasn't easy. Corporate NDAs aren't exactly known for their flexibility. But I found a way to connect with someone close to the decision makers. Through careful probing, I learned that the client hadn't been entirely satisfied with Sterling's handling of the deal. In fact, they'd raised significant objections about certain clauses in the contract, only to have their concerns brushed off by Richard and his team. Armed with this information, I drafted a detailed report outlining not only my contributions to the project, but also the discrepancies between Sterling's public statements and the reality of the situation. I included screenshots of emails, meeting notes, and even audio recordings. Yes, I'd recorded a few key conversations. Call it professional paranoia. Then, I sent it to the client anonymously, along with a note encouraging them to review the terms carefully before signing anything official. Days turned into weeks, and I heard nothing. For a while, I wondered if I'd made a mistake, if the client would side with Sterling, choosing to overlook the issues rather than risk jeopardizing the partnership. But then, late one evening, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The caller identified themselves as a representative from the tech startup, thanking me for bringing the discrepancies to their attention. They assured me they were conducting their own internal review and hinted that the deal might not move forward as planned. It was a small victory, but it gave me hope. Hope that justice wasn't just a pipe dream. Hope that Sterling's house of cards might finally come crashing down. By the time federal agents showed up at Sterling's offices, I was ready. Months of preparation had led to this moment, the culmination of sleepless nights, whispered conversations, and countless cups of coffee. As I watched from afar, hidden among the crowd of curious onlookers gathered outside the building, I couldn't help but smile. Their faces said it all: shock, disbelief, panic. Richard looked like he'd seen a ghost, while Margaret clutched her pearls as if trying to hold herself together. They thought they could break me. Instead, I broke them. But here's the thing about revenge. It's never truly satisfying. Oh, sure, there's a fleeting sense of triumph, a rush of vindication that feels intoxicating in the moment. But when the dust settles, you're left with the same question that haunted you before. What now? For me, the answer came unexpectedly. As the scandal unfolded, reporters began digging deeper, uncovering layers of corruption that extended far beyond Sterling and company. My story, our story, became a rallying cry for others who'd suffered in silence. Women who'd been dismissed, marginalized, or outright erased found strength in knowing they weren't alone. And somewhere along the way, I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about creating change. Real, lasting change. So I didn't stop. How could I? There were still battles to fight, injustices to expose, and voices that needed amplifying. And as I stood there watching the chaos unfold, I knew one thing for certain. Evelyn Carter wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. As the federal agents led Richard and Margaret out in handcuffs, their faces pale with disbelief, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. Revenge hadn't fixed everything. It hadn't given me back my old life or erased the scars Sterling had left behind. But it had done something important. It had sparked a fire, a movement. Women and men across industries began speaking out, demanding accountability and change. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. Hopeful that maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to listen. And as I walked away from the scene, disappearing into the crowd, I knew this wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Evelyn Carter was no longer just a name on a resignation letter. She was a force to be reckoned with, and her story was far from over.